Trish and Rob McGregor welcome you to a place where all kinds of phenomena flourish. Voices whisper ancient secrets, signs and symbols are abundant. UFOs, ETs, ghosts, and even the dead move about freely. Here we meet authors, researchers, and investigators of the mysterious, the strange, and of the inexplicable anomalies that surround us. Step out of the everyday world and take a journey into the mystical underground. Okay, all right. If you guys are ready, we'll start in 3, 2, 1.
Welcome to the Mystical Underground. Thank you for joining us. This is Rob McGregor
and Trish McGregor.
And our producer and tech magician, John Posey. You can go to themysticalunderground.com where we make regular blog posts and where you can find out about our books. Among them are Phenomena, Harnessing Your Psychic Abilities, The Secrets of Spirit Communication, Sensing the Future, and Aliens in the Backyard. Our latest book is called Mind-Blowing Synchronicities, the Latest Science, Stories, and Research. Trish's latest novel, White Crows, and Rob's latest novel is called Tulpas, a story about mysterious beings created through deep meditation.
Julia Gordon-Bramer is a professional tarot card reader, Sylvia Plath scholar, award-winning writer, and poet, and former professor for the graduate writing program at Lindenwood University. Author of Fixed Stars, Govern a Life, Decoding Sylvia Plath, Tarot Life Lessons, and the Occult Sylvia Plath, which is what we're going to talk about today. She is also one of St. Louis's top 10 psychics and St. Louis's #1 fortune teller, and has appeared on numerous TV and radio shows, as well as appearances on Nickelodeon and MTV. In 2013, the Riverfront Times voted her St. Louis's best local poet. She lives in St. Louis, Missouri. Welcome, Julia, and sorry for all the mix-up.
Yeah, welcome, Julia. Yeah.
Hi, it's nice to be back.
Right.
Even with all our mix-ups.
Right.
Yeah.
So this book was intended to be the introduction to your first book, Fixed Stars, Govern a Life, Decoding Sylvia Plath. When and why did you decide it was its own biography?
Yeah, well, so Fixed Stars, Govern a Life is literary analysis. It's going over Plath's work line by line and explaining what she was doing with this sort of, mystic template that she had used for her collection of poems, Ariel. I originally thought, well, I needed an introduction to explain why I had this, why I was seeking to do this. And that introduction just grew and grew and grew and grew. My Fixed Stars, Govern a Life is quite a long book in its own right. I mean, it's a textbook. It's been used in some schools and universities. And I had so much information that I kept finding. And so I just wrote a much briefer introduction to my first book and kept working on what became the Occult Sylvia Plath for a long time. And you may even see in old interviews with me, I called it The Magician's Girl. And that was my working title. And that is a line from a Sylvia Plath poem, as is Fixed Stars, Govern a Life. And she really, she really looked to her husband, Ted Hughes, as a mentor, and he was seriously steeped in the occult and mysticism. So interesting because his work has been widely studied for all of these occult influences, for the alchemy and the Kabbalah and the astrology and all of that. He's been written about, like crazy, and yet no one thought to look at Plath's work in this same light. It's really quite astounding.
Yeah, when I went to Wikipedia and looked her up, Sylvia Plath, there was no subheadings called occult or Ouija or anything like that.
Right.
I looked and I couldn't find anything actually.
Yeah. And that's because academia, by and large, likes to hold her in the frame of a confessional poet, and
like Anne Sexton.
Yes, exactly.
Uh-huh.
And especially with regard to the depression and suicide.
Uh-huh.
So that's where the drama is. That's what the focus of the movie with Gwyneth Paltrow and Daniel Craig was. They were very beautiful, Ted Hughes and Sylvia Plath, and so they got very beautiful actors to play them. But it was not about the genius. It was just about the drama. And that's a darn shame. It's kind of my hope, my purpose, I think, that I'm here to lift her out of that and show that she was really a genius's genius. In my first book, I attempt to show that she, in each of her 40 aerial poems, she had at least 6 different meanings in the same set of words. So just imagine trying to do that. You've heard of double meanings. She has sextuple meanings that all work and work really well. There's a reason we still read and talk about Plath today. And I don't think we're aware of it, but she's truly put a spell on us. Her work resonates on all these different levels. And so that's my goal, is to show everybody what Plath was doing.
It's interesting too, because Anne Sexton is so written about, and she was, her poetry you see in various places, and Plath just has never had that kind of exposure.
Well, I'm not so sure about that. It's different, certainly Plath has not had the exposure with regard to mysticism, but Plath and Sexton were friends, and they used to have their 3 martini lunches in Boston, and at the Ritz. It's a different, maybe slightly different crowd. Sexton's crowd is a little, Sexton was a little rougher around the edges.
Yeah.
And
exactly.
and Plath was more academic and more serious. And I think that plays into why she kept the mysticism on the down low. She didn't want to be perceived as crazy. She had been institutionalized and had gone through shock therapy. So of course, this wasn't the first thing she wanted people to match up with her. And the idea of the occult and mysticism, while it was becoming pretty fashionable for the time in the 1960s, it was on the heels, in 1951 England, I believe it was 51, it had only just been taken off the books in England as a crime. So Plath met Ted Hughes in 1956. So, just a handful of years after that. So it still had a lot of stigma, and it was still a very Christian kind of society with conservative values. So yeah, it wasn't something she really spoke about.
Yeah.
Not to mention she had young children.
Yeah. But what's interesting to me is that Sexton wrote her first book of poetry in a cuckoo house. She was institutionalized.
Yeah. Yeah. And
she didn't hide it.
Right. I can't speak a whole lot for Anne Sexton. Just I've read her, I've read about her, but I'm not a Sexton scholar. So I don't want to say anything wrong there. But Plath certainly got a lot of her early inspiration. The Bell Jar is all about her breakdown and being institutionalized, and the shock therapy and all of that. So it's all, it all certainly was a big part of their lives. My goal is to just show that it wasn't the only part of their lives, and it wasn't the only creative underpinning in the work. And Plath was going on very deep on multiple levels, and so my first 3 books explore her work kind of in line by line analysis. But this book that's out now, The Occult Sylvia Plath, this is a biography. This is much more readable. You don't have to be a scholar. We don't have to have the text in front of us. It's the story of her mysticism and really her family's mysticism, as well as Ted Hughes and his family's mysticism. They all kind of grew up in this and were raised in this and got better and stronger as young adults.
But her,
Now, how did they use the Ouija board? That when you mentioned the Ouija board, I was
Yeah,
curious about that.
that was a regular practice. And Sylvia Plath has, it's funny, scholars and even people who've read her journals and her letters know they see all of these mystical things, like the Ouija board, like the crystal ball, like the tarot, like bibliomancy, like astrology. Plath has written about all of this stuff, one way or the other, but it hasn't been looked at cohesively. People just think, oh, little entertainment, just a lark, just a silly thing. And they didn't understand that she was really quite obsessed with the occult in various ways. And, it's up for debate whether you want to say whether it worked for her or not. My argument is that it worked quite well on the professional level, but not necessarily the personal level.
or the financial level, right? She couldn't get the numbers right.
Yeah, right. She certainly had some struggle there, and it seemed like there was never enough money. She was also young. She was 30 when she died, so yeah. I think of her immaturity that we tend to overlook. She had a lot to process yet, that she hadn't really been clear on, from the mystic point of view. She was not evolved from the mystical point of view, even though she was more than dabbling, even an active practitioner, and quite evolved with the Kabbalistic structure in her work. But she broke a lot of rules. And in fact, two of the main rules in Kabbalah is that the ancient Jewish rabbis said, because Kabbalah is, of course, from Jewish mysticism, is number one, you must be male, and number two, you must be over 40. And she was neither male nor over 40, and Ted Hughes was not over 40. And I'm sure they just both figured, since they were geniuses, and they knew they were geniuses, that when you get to have a certain level of intelligence and you're winning all the fellowships and grants and contests, and they knew, but they didn't have that maturity, that spiritual evolution that comes with age. Wisdom comes with age and experience, and for all that they may have experienced, they weren't there yet.
And you said
he was older than she was, right?
About 4 years, yeah. 4 not years. Terribly older.
You said that her family, her parents, were into the occult as well. But how about her descendants or relatives? Haven't they been kind of involved in keeping the occult out of her history?
Not necessarily hers, more his side of the family, who inherited the estate.
Yeah.
So, I'd just like to clarify. So Sylvia Plath's father was a Freemason. We know this. He had a rough childhood. He was basically abandoned by his family at 15. He got on a boat and came to America all by himself as a boy, and learned English, because he had to, not because he went to school for it, just in a strange new land, and made his way, and was quite brilliant. But he had some issues, and he's been written about as being this very brutal, harsh man. In the Occult Sylvia Plath, one of the things I attempt to do is to show the humanity of all the characters who've been really maligned and stereotyped. And I start with Otto Plath and his story. But yes, he was a Freemason. But to say he was an occult practitioner himself, I feel that might be going a little too far. Although, how deep was he into Freemasonry? I don't know, because it is, of course, a secret society. There's not a lot of documents on that. Aurelia Plath was she got her master's degree on the alchemist Paracelsus. And so that's pretty interesting all by itself. She has said that Sylvia Plath read every one of her school books. So we know for a fact, just from that that Plath studied alchemy. When Plath was 15, she carved a hermetic caduceus, which is kind of like a magic wand, which I am the owner of today. I'm really happy to say.
Wow. How'd you
keep
get
it-
that?
Oh, it's a little bit of a long story. I'll tell you if you
Okay.
want,
Yeah.
but yeah, so just to get back real quick, she was raised with these influences. Plath went to the Unitarian Church, the Universalist Unitarian Church, and she makes notes of her homework or her Sunday school homework in things like astrology and the zodiac, which my goodness, in my Sunday school, we were not doing anything like that.
No.
That was the devil's work.
Right. Well, I was in the Episcopal Church, and my church was a little different because I talked about this in my book, Tarot Life Lessons, that you and I spoke about. I was learning things like meditation and automatic writing, and the people in my church spoke in tongues. And that was an Episcopal church. So it wasn't like your traditional.
That's unusual.
Yeah, it wasn't Pentecostal, but yeah, so I realized kind of late in life that everybody's church wasn't quite like mine, but Plath had me beat for sure. So I think it's important to see all of these influences in her childhood that kind of set her up for Ted Hughes and what he was introducing her to, which was mainly Kabbalah. In its various different incarnations. And Kabbalah, of course, is sort of the framework for all of the occult sciences. Tarot fits in the Kabbalah tree of life, as does mythology, which Plath had a rabid interest for.
And astrology as well.
And astrology and numerology and gematria and really so many of the occult sciences, they all kind of fit on this Kabbalistic structure, which is, I consider it kind of the blueprint for the universe. I think if God could be diagrammed, that would be Kabbalah. That would be the Kabbalah tree of life.
Interesting.
Yeah. And I never knew a thing about Kabbalah except that like Madonna had a red thread around her wrist for Kabbalah. I knew very little about it except for the word until I came into the Plath work, and that got me down that rabbit hole.
Yeah.
Now, how come you own her magic wand?
Yeah. So, and I think it was 2021. I was approached by a mutual friend who was working with Dr. Richard Larson. So Richard Larson was a friend of the Plath families. And he has a number of items, still has a number of items that belonged to Sylvia Plath, that Aurelia Plath, Sylvia's mother, gave him. Dr. Larson was like another son to Aurelia Plath, and he helped her with all kinds of things. And so he also became a Plath scholar himself. And so he had a lot of items, and one of these things was the hermetic caduceus that Sylvia hand carved when she was 15. And so he's an elderly man now, and I guess he's thinking about who should he bequeath these objects to. And so I was contacted by this mutual friend who said, did I want to make an offer on it? And I was like, oh gosh, I wouldn't have that kind of money. And I'll just say he gave it to me for a pittance. And it was because he wanted the right person to have it, who appreciated her mysticism. And so just to give you an idea of the value, if you'd like to see a picture of it, I have some pictures on both my Twitter and my Instagram and my Facebook, now that I think of it. You'd have to search for hermetic caduceus on Twitter or Facebook, and you have to scroll down a little bit on my Instagram, but you'll see me holding it, and it's about that big, and made of wood, and it's got her initials SP at the base of it, which is really wonderful. But to get an idea of the value, Sylvia Plath's tarot cards, which she did not make, they were just something she bought. And there's not even the hard evidence that she used this particular pack. I actually believe she used a Rider-Waite pack, and the pack that there was a pack that was auctioned off in 2020. And those tarot cards, it was a Tarot de Marseille deck. Those tarot cards were auctioned off for over $200,000 US.
Wow.
Oh my
and
God.
she did not make those. And
Yeah.
so you can imagine how much, what the value is on these. I'll tell you a funny story. I was just in conversation with the television show, the Discovery Channel television show Pawn Stars. Not because I want to pawn it off, no way, no how, but because I wanted to get an idea of the value. And unfortunately, they were very interested in having me on, and they wanted this object, but unfortunately, they wanted me to sign some papers to have an amount that I would be willing to let go of, and I'm thinking like $1 million, like really, it would be like that much. I'm sure that this thing is worth more than my house, and so anyway, we couldn't come to an agreement because they are, of course, a pawn shop, and so they would have to make their money. And so, yeah, so I don't think I'm going to be on Pawn Stars, but it was fun talking back and forth.
Yeah.
Well, do you use it, or do you keep it somewhere safe? Or
So
both?
It is locked up in a safe. It is the most valuable thing I own, and it is in a safe. And I and on occasion I'll take it out on a full moon, or just to kind of power it on my windowsill or something. I have taken it out on very important projects, and just asked for her guidance, and yeah.
Cool.
And
what kind of wood?
I do not know. I'm not an expert on wood. It's dark brown.
Yeah, right.
It was soft enough that she could carve it, but I really couldn't tell you what kind of wood.
That is very cool.
Yeah.
Some mystical objects like that, you have to be a little bit careful with them, because we know the man who has the Mitchell Hedges crystal skull, and he won't go on an airplane with it because he's afraid it would be confiscated. And
Oh.
go ahead, John.
Oh, no, I was just going to say, would it make sense that maybe it's rosewood? Would that make any sense whatsoever? Just out of curiosity, because that is a dark wood, and it's soft and easily.
Maybe, maybe. I have no idea. I'm just not any kind of expert on wood.
That is so, well, don't ever take it on an airplane.
Yeah. Well, if I did, I would, if I did, it would be on me, but
Yeah.
but yeah, I don't, it would be a rare occasion that I would take it anywhere. I don't think there's going to be reason to take it anywhere. So
That's so cool.
Yeah. I just love that I own it, and and I think the most important objects to us are priceless to us. I mean, I really cannot think of a dollar amount that you could ask me to hand it over, because I feel so blessed. I feel like she chose me to have, and it was funny because when the auction was going on, when her tarot cards were there, I had a very wealthy, wonderful client who wanted to buy those for me as a gift, and she had bid. She told me she had bid $10,000, but of course she wasn't willing to go over $200,000. Nor would I expect her to. But how sweet, right? That she had wanted to spend $10,000 to buy those for me.
That's incredible.
And that, just, people recognized that they saw me and mysticism, like, they were saying, oh, Julia should have that, long before the caduceus was up for sale. And it wasn't up for any sort of public sale, like in an auction. But yeah, I just feel so blessed, like Plath designated me.
Did you use it for inspiration when you wrote the book?
No, I had already written the book when I got the caduceus.
Oh, you are? Okay.
It was complete. Yeah. Yeah. In fact, I just felt like everything very much came into alignment. I've had a lot of signs that I've been on track with Sylvia. And people have asked me, does she talk to you? Do you hear her? Do you see her? And and as a psychic, I'm open to that. Very, I cannot say that that she's, made herself clearly manifest. I've had some dreams. I had what I do say in the introduction of my very first book, Fixed Stars Govern a Life. I had a moment in the scholarship where I became really uneasy because I found that her poem Ariel was very closely in alignment, almost a paraphrasing of a prayer poem written by Aleister Crowley to the great beast 666. And that disturbed me. And I thought, oh shoot, are my heroes Satanists? And I really, as I said, I have an Episcopalian background, and I really do, while I'm certainly not a traditional Christian, I really do consider myself, Christian and in love and light and positivity. And I didn't, the whole Crowley dark black magic stuff is not appealing to me, not my scene. And I thought, oh God, I don't want to go there. And I was really almost in a crisis where I thought, when I went to bed that night, I thought, maybe I'm going to give this up. Maybe I'm just not going to do it anymore. And as I was drifting off to sleep, Plath spoke to me, and I know her voice very well from recordings. And she said, move through. It was a command, and it was loud, and it frightened me, but it was loud enough that I did not forget it. And so I said, all right, I'll go to the next poem. Well, the next poem, she had each poem in accordance with the tarot card. And the next poem after Ariel was in alignment with the Devil card. And that's when I realized, oh, it was a setup, she was introducing the Devil. Yeah. So fascinating. And then I was able to move through and to see the evolution, just as the tarot's major arcana evolves us from that Fool card all the way to the world, the highest potential, our self-actualization. And we have our Devil phase of our ego and the material world and all of that. And Crowley was perhaps really caught in that, by the way, for an occultist, he was very much into power games and ego and, so it made total sense. But that was one of the guidances, I guess you could say, I got from Sylvia. Another one, I was in the archives working in Bloomington, Indiana, and I had done a long day in the archives and spent the night in the hotel there. And I was getting ready in the morning. And I wasn't even like super conscious of what I was doing, but I spoke to Sylvia out loud, and I just said, Sylvia, do you want me to keep reading the 1945 journals or go on to something a little more interesting? Because her 1945 journals are her little girl stuff. She was about 9 or 10, and it's, it's amusing. I mean, there's some cool moments, like she talks about, that the United States dropped bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and she talks about FDR's death, and she has some historical moments. She was, even as a little girl, she was very bright and she recorded a lot, but she was a little girl, so she was also writing about all the food she ate at summer camp, and and all her radio shows and the books that she was reading and whatever. And so I was just sort of getting a little bored, like I'd been at it for, I would pull these 8-hour days of just sitting in one position and not eating lunch. And really, it's really hard on the body. It's to be in an archives like that, and you can't move around, and a very sterile, quiet environment. And it's very physically hard on you. It's a cold room, and so it's hard on the body. So I just sort of expressed this, like, do I stay in 1945 or can I go on to when you're a young adult? And then on the television, which I just had on in the background, I hear 1945. And I looked, and it was some World War II movie that they were talking about. And I was just like, holy smokes. So I stayed in 1945. And what do you know? I found a lot of really important information that day. And I just had to keep at it. And, so.
That's a good synchronicity.
Yeah.
That's a real good confirmation synchronicity.
Yes. And then, and then I've had some others. So the funny thing is, I have actually seen Ted in sort of peripheral moments, and kind of over there and in mirrors, and he makes himself seen. Sylvia doesn't.
That's interesting.
Now, when did he die? When did he die?
He died in 1998.
Okay.
Yeah. And so, I wish I had started this work at a younger age so I could have met and interviewed him. My husband teases me about that, Ted Hughes had every woman he met in his bed. So Tom says, oh, well, it would, you'd be another one he'd conquer,
Real quick, I have to circle back around to the Rosewood since Crowley came up. Interesting is that Jimmy Page, who has quite a history with Crowley's legacy, preferred rosewood fretboards on his guitars.
That's
kind of a wand if you think about it, but
isn't that interesting? And I'll have to do a little rosewood study and see what comes up there. It's the kind of work that I just continue to keep learning, like it never stops. The Occult Sylvia Plath, this was 15 years in that archive, and I just kept finding things. I kept I would sit and I would read the books she read, and she would have all her little marginalia and underlinings, and she would star certain things, and annotations and other on calendars, and everything was just continually supporting my work. And so I realized we needed a biography on her mysticism. That there's a ton of Plath biographies out there, but they're all on her drama. Very few people say anything really new. For a time, I got worried that author Carl Rollison had beat me to it, because he did in about maybe 10 years now, maybe not quite that long. He put out a biography called American Isis about Plath, and he had a lot of sort of mystical terminology in like the title and the chapter titles, but it wasn't really about that at all. So people have identified that she's got a lot of mystic kind of flavoring, that she used a lot of words that sounded very mystic, that she has poems entitled Ouija and mystic, and but they didn't put it all together, and it's just astounding to me.
How much on your previous books did you write about the occult influences?
Well, the 3 books on Plath are all about that. But what I do, their analysis. So they're looking at her poems line by line and explaining what she was doing, and this is biography. So this is more of a readable story.
Gosh, I had a question that just flew out of my head. Oh, I know. What do you think other than the Ouija board and the Kabbalah, what other types of occult things was she involved in?
Okay, well, bibliomancy, astrology, tarot. She wrote quite a bit about tarot. Her most famous poem, Daddy, she makes a reference, and this might have been one of the first things that set me on my course here. She says, "And my Tarok pack, I may be a bit of a Jew." That's what she says. It's interesting. Plath has been maligned for all of these Jewish references, like who is this white bread Boston girl to associate herself with Holocaust and the Jewish imagery. And and yes, she was definitely working that symbolism,
Mhm.
but the Jewish imagery really is referencing Kabbalah, because Kabbalah is ancient Jewish mysticism. And so almost everything she did had that Kabbalistic, I mean, because Kabbalah is that framework for the occult sciences. They all feed into that. So the ones that I've named, I mean, she had witchy bonfires at the end of her life where she was so angry at Ted Hughes, and she was putting in his dandruff and his fingernail clippings, and and trying to cast a spell on him, and she got kind of extreme there. For a self-proclaimed atheist, which she did proclaim she was the most spiritual atheist ever. And she had many of these practices. My book, The Occult Sylvia Plath, is in 4 parts, and each part opens with a scene of them over the Ouija board. And that all it is written straight from her long poem, Dialogue Over a Ouija Board. And in that poem, she has 2 characters. She has Sybil and Leroy, but we know from her journals and from her letters that is in fact her and Ted Hughes. And all of the language is there, and the loss of the father at a young age, and should they try to find him, and it's all in this poem. So it's very clearly Sylvia and Ted. But so what I did was I turned that poem into a scene, and I wrote it just creatively, and I filled in all the details from, if she talked about the room to her mother and how she was decorating it, I described the room around them. And so every detail that I've put in there is biographical fact. And I've just set the scene of them, conjuring, calling in the spirits. And I think it worked out pretty well. It's pretty fun. And so it's not just a dry biography. It's not just fact, it's more readable than the average academic book, shall we say. It's more readable than my first 3 books on Plath.
Where is this archive?
There are 2 Plath archives, 2 major Plath archives. There are some smaller ones. There's one right in my town of St. Louis at Washington University. They've got not a Plath archive, but they've got some important items that I've held and studied and looked over. But the main ones, the one I spent the most time with is in Indiana University in Bloomington at the Lilly Library. And that has it's got actual locks of her hair, which the curator gave me a little bit. So I also own a little bit of Sylvia Plath's hair.
Oh boy.
That's how you contact
That's very witchy.
Yeah. My husband thought that was a little too creepy, but they have many of her books. Over at the Smith College, where she went to school in Northampton, they have her Girl Scout uniform, and they have her desk, and they have her typewriter. They have more of her books and her dictionary and things like that. Her dictionary is very, very cool because she underlined all of the mystic words, and I talk about that in the Occult Sylvia Plath. She was very, very interested in witchcraft and a lot of the darker stuff, demons and possessions and things like that. Yeah.
Did she and Ted ever get readings from psychics?
They did. Well, we know that they went to see a witch in Devon a couple of times.
Okay.
And I know for a fact Ted did post Sylvia Plath, after she died. My part 4 is called After Plath, and it's Ted's kind of excursions into the occult and his continual haunting from Sylvia. I use the term haunting kind of loosely, but he really could not escape, maybe his guilt for her death, but because he certainly was guilty. He didn't kill her but he might have been the one to push her off the edge emotionally. She had had a little bit too much, and she had everything going wrong at the end. It was the worst winter in London in 100 years, and he had abandoned her and her two small children. And she had the flu. Actually, they all had the flu, and everything was freezing, and pipes were breaking, and everything was going wrong in their new London apartment. And The Bell Jar had just been published to mediocre reviews, if you can believe that. A book that remains a bestseller today.
Jeez.
Yeah, remains a
That's
bestseller
incredible.
today, but she did not see the success of The Bell Jar in her lifetime. And the Colossus had, her first book of poems had kind of flopped. So, she had a lot of pain and a lot of things going wrong, and it was kind of just all too much, and she was not stable. So her daughter Frida is a couple years older than I am, and she is still alive. And she was the one behind that auction in 2020. She had auctioned off a lot of her mother's things. She is an artist and a poet, and she's written quite a bit about her hard life growing up after her mother killed herself, and she had a lot of pain that she's written about. And some of her books have fed into the Occult Sylvia Plath with some of the details. Unfortunately, and most tragically, their son Nicholas, who was younger than Frida, killed himself. I think it might have been in 2007. I can't remember the exact year. Maybe 2010. I'm not sure of the year, but depression and suicide ran through their family. That's sad. And it's very sad. Yeah. And he had lived a very quiet life. He was a marine biologist in Alaska, and just kind of did his own thing. He was very close to his father, and he killed himself after his father died. I sometimes wonder if that was intentional, like maybe his dad was a reason to keep him here, But very, very tragic.
Yeah.
How old was he?
Oh, I don't remember. I don't remember offhand. But still youngish, maybe 40-ish, something like that.
Yeah. So the occult Sylvia Plath could also be called the occult Sylvia Plath and Ted Hughes. You give him a lot of play.
Absolutely. I mean, Plath is more famous here in America. Over on the UK side, Ted Hughes is more famous. He was the poet laureate of Britain for a long time, and till he died. So he wrote poems for William and Harry even, and and I should say mystical poems at that for William and Harry. He believed that he was an important part of keeping England together, and that he could never leave the country because the country of England needed him. Yeah. Anyway, it is equally Ted Hughes, because she really learned from him. As I said, my working title was The Magician's Girl, and that's from a line in her poem, The Bee Meeting. I am the magician's girl who does not flinch. And I, and kind of referencing the old Sorcerer's Apprentice story. And just like in the Sorcerer's Apprentice, I believe that Plath became as powerful or more powerful than her master. And she learned, and she was the most willing student. And that's another reason she cracked, because she gave everything to Ted, and he's acknowledged he might have pushed her a little too far in the occult. She might have needed a more normal life. And but he, well, both of them, poetry was everything. Poetry was more important than personal happiness. It was more important than their marriage, although they agreed that their marriage was poetry. I mean, they wrote together, they gave each other exercises, they practiced, they meditated together, they worked on hypnotizing each other, all for poetry. And it was largely successful.
What birth sign was she?
She was a Scorpio. Plath was a Scorpio.
I knew it.
Yeah, very.
And what about him?
very
Yeah.
intense. He was a Leo.
Oh boy. No
Mhm.
wonder.
Yeah.
Interesting.
Can you
I'm
talk a
gonna have to
little
look
bit?
at her chart.
Yeah, can you talk a little bit about Pan, the being that came through on the Ouija board, or the spirit?
Yeah. So Pan is one of the Greek gods who's synonymous with the Fool card in the tarot, and he's Dionysus. He's the wild, crazy energy.
Right.
And they did believe that they were contacting Pan continually. Some relate Pan with the devil himself. Some people are really uneasy with that kind of energy, and when you're they had a friend, Al Alvarez, who was the editor at the London Times, who knew both Plath and Hughes very well, and he wrote an article that was published called "Did Black Magic Kill Sylvia Plath?" And he really believed that they went too deep into it, and that it kind of took her down. So, one of the things I cut myself off on when I was telling you about their Kabbalah practices, and that they broke two of the major rules of Kabbalah, which was that you had to be over 40 and you had to be a man. The punishment for breaking that is madness. And I think that's really interesting, because it could be argued that Plath went mad, and even Hughes in his way. Differently mad, but still he was not a happy person. And
he
many
died a
would have said
natural death, though.
He did. He died of cancer. And he tried to fight it with mysticism right until the end. He had all kinds of faith healers, and and when his mother had cancer, he had her on crazy like orange and onion juice diets, and he was trying to cure her in the same way. So he really had a lot of faith. I'll say that Hughes seemed to have much more faith than Sylvia, but Sylvia worshipped him, and she looked to him for all the guidance and all the practices. And when they sent their work out to be published, they made sure that it was on astrologically auspicious dates, and and that things were in certain alignment, and it mostly worked out for them pretty well.
Did they ever speak publicly about their interest in works in the occult?
No, Ted a little bit. Ted did to some other writers and biographers and some close friends. And they spoke about their favorite people they like to read, who were a lot of the mystic poets like Yeats and Blake, and of their contemporary times like D.H. Lawrence and Robert Graves. But they kept that under wraps, because again, especially Sylvia was in academia and wanted to be respected, and she didn't want to be called crazy, especially with her background, having been institutionalized and everything. So, and they had young children, and there's a lot to consider. Reputation was very important back then. Today you can be a little more wild as a writer, but not so much then.
So what was the academic objection to her? Basically that it was, since she wrote about the occult.
Yeah, academia is notoriously atheistic, and that's why they're pushing back on me today. That's why you look on Wikipedia and you don't see anything, because they don't want to go there. That's uncomfortable. It's weird. It's not something they understand, and they would just rather look at it as an amusing pastime, playing with a Ouija board or whatever, than to take it seriously, but like my aim is to show it all collectively and to explain what they were doing, both as an artist, which I am. I'm also a poet and a writer, and as a mystic, which I also am. And, and I really do think you need to be both to see this connection. Everybody sees all the occult around Plath, and all the stuff she wrote about and talked about, and levitations and dreams, and she wrote she wrote about all of it, but it just hasn't been viewed collectively or seriously. In her time, academia was more conservative. So in her time, they were still more Christian in schools. Today, you know, that's been thrown out the window, but it's atheism now, and there is no faith now, you know, no beliefs in any systems. And if you believe in something, you're an idiot. You know, that's kind of the prevailing mindset today. Yeah.
Well, I find that even Sheldrake, his work is sort of ridiculed. Rupert Sheldrake, you know, morphic resonance and all that. And if you look him up on Wikipedia.
Yeah, they really put him down. Yeah.
Yeah, they do.
So what are the sources that you used for your book, since there wasn't really much written on the occult about her?
So I went to the main sources in the archive. I went to her writings. So first off, and most obviously, and what's available for everybody to read, is her journals and her letters. They have been published now. So her letters just came out a couple of years ago. When I was doing this research, those letters were not out yet. But they're available for everybody to read in her own words. More interestingly is the, you know, what I would call the ephemera that's in the archives. Things like her book Marginalia, and her underlinings, and her little starred notations, and you know, notes in her calendars. You know, none of that has been published. Scrapbook. I have a lot taken from memoirs and letters from other people to them or about them. You know, other biographies that, you know, people who knew Plath, who sat in school with her in the classroom with Robert Lowell, or who, you know, have written that they went to high school with her, or who have written about, you know, I took quite a bit from her neighbor downstairs, who was the last person to see her alive, Dr. Trevor Thomas. So there's, you know, and his memoir was self-published, so, you know, in sort of real academic terms, unpublished, but he made a bunch of copies of it, and that's interesting because he gave Aurelia Plath a copy of it, and he wrote on it to Aurelia Plath, you know, with his best regards or whatever, and signed it, and this memoir disturbed Aurelia so much that she cut her name out of it. She didn't want her name attached on it. And that went to Richard Larson, which is now also in my possession. So,
oh, wow.
So I have a copy of that, Trevor Thomas's memoir, and Last Encounters, Final Encounters, something like that. Anyway, it's really interesting. There's a lot of information. Ted Hughes's lovers have written some tell-all books about him, and a lot of the witchcraft and occult stuff is in that, especially post. But they talked many times of his being unable to forget Sylvia and the things he said about Sylvia, and, you know, it was pretty interesting to just pull it all together. Very few people have read all the books that I've read. You know, I've been, over these 15 years, I've been trying to read the books that Plath read. Most often I've tried to read them in the archives so that I could see how she interacted with them, with underlinings, because she did a lot of writing and scribbling in her books, which is wonderful, and really shows us how she processed them and what was important to her. So all of this is in my book, The Occult Sylvia Plath, with footnotes. So if you get really interested in something that I found and you want to go to the archives to look at it yourself, you can do that.
Who arranged for this archive? I'm sorry, John.
Oh, no, go ahead.
You know?
Go ahead and finish that.
I was just curious who arranged for this archive.
Well, any scholar who can prove their scholarship
Okay.
can prove that they're doing something, can go. And you do
Uh-huh.
have to kind of apply. You have to write them and say, I want to visit and I'm going to be in town this time and I want to work on such and such.
Yeah.
And then you request certain manuscripts to be made available to you. Because, they're in storage. Like, we're not rifling through storage ourselves.
Right.
The librarians have to bring them to us.
Uh-huh.
And yeah, so that's kind of how it goes.
So,
John, what were we going to ask?
so yeah, and wow, and we may not have time for this question, and I'm not even sure that I can actually ask the question properly. But you brought up atheism, and its presence in institutions. And I actually was watching a podcast a couple of days ago where an atheist was being interviewed was the guest on the podcast. And the atheist said that we are living amongst soulless people, automatons. And this is an atheist speaking, saying that there are people around him that he just does not believe have a soul. And for an atheist to say that he's walking amongst soulless people, I don't even know how you get there. But anyway,
it's a very depressed time. I mean, this is perhaps the time in history where we are most depressed and mentally ill as a culture, as a society, and which is really tragic. And I think that there is such nihilism and this living only for the moment and belief that there's nothing beyond. It really is undoing us as human beings, and limiting our potential and our growth and our capability to be happy. So it's so sad. Well, I'll say one thing about atheism. There are, like Plath, there are a group of very spiritual atheists who still believe in oneness, who still believe that there's something greater. They just don't call it God necessarily. They don't see it as, a man on the throne in the sky.
Right.
It's less of a being and more of an energy. And many of those kind of atheists can get on board with what I'm saying because they get it. And I think Plath was one of those.
Yeah.
And there's a lot of people who believe that there's a spiritual shift going on among people too, and that there are millions of people. It's very underlying and not really part of the popular media attention at all, but there is something going on. And every week we have people who come on here who talk about this in spite of, the polarity in everyday life, that there's something higher going on that exists beyond the everyday world.
Yeah. And I'd like to think that in my small way, the Occult Sylvia Plath is helping shift that, because you're going to read it and you're going to see that whether you're on board with what they did or not, they had some power. They had something was going on. There's something bigger than them. And if you take it a step further and read my other books and really see what she was doing line by line in her poetry, she was a genius's genius, and she had mastered spells, in the true literary meaning of spelling. And she did, an art. She created an art that just resonates on so many different levels. So I call that God.
And I guess I was just interested in the fact that this person because I don't, obviously we use soul in kind of a slang way at times. Just somebody is not engaged in whatever that they're working on. But I found it interesting that this particular person chose to say that there are people that are
soulless,
that are very. I don't think he was using it as a slang term, and that there are people with souls and there are people without souls. Now, what does that mean? Does that map to anything that Sylvia would have believed, it just caught me off guard when this particular person would even use that term.
Yeah,
Exactly,
that
yeah.
is very interesting.
Yeah.
Hmm.
So I have a more practical question about their objects. So what happened to their Ouija board?
Don't know. Do not know.
Really?
Uh-huh.
Yeah. Ted Hughes made it. He created it himself. He may have taken it with him. It may be in his objects somewhere. Maybe Frida Hughes has it. Do not know. Yeah.
Okay, that's
Interesting. That may show up for auction.
Yeah. That would be worth a fortune.
Yeah, I bet.
Yeah, that would be.
With their kind of energies, that's something I'm not sure I'd want. Isn't that interesting? That might be a little too dark. Yeah.
Especially since he made it.
Right.
Since he made it.
They used a glass as like a cursor to move to the letters?
They used a brandy glass, as the planchette.
Oh, planchette. Yeah, right.
God.
Well, this has been very interesting.
Well, I wonder where that glass is. This has been fascinating.
Yeah.
Well, now, Julie, tell everybody where they can find your book and get in touch with you and all that.
Absolutely. So you can find the Occult Sylvia Plath on any major bookseller, and I've also recorded an audiobook in my own voice. So you can find that. You can also find my previous book that I talked to you about, Tarot Life Lessons, same place, also an audiobook. And that does have in my first chapter in Tarot Life Lessons, where I tell my own story, I do talk about the Plath work a little bit in that as well. So I wanted to mention that. If you were interested in a tarot card reading with me or wanting to learn more about me, you can go to my website, juliagordonbramer.com, and I'll spell that JuliaGordon, B as in boy, RAM as in Mary, ER.com.
So
I have a question. Did my brother-in-law ever come to you for a reading?
Gosh, I'll have to go back and check because I've done so much, but that's a real, we need to check.
I can't remember. I'll have to ask him.
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay.
So you do telephone and Zoom readings then?
I do readings by phone, by video, all kinds of, Zoom, Google Duo, FaceTime. I do email readings. I've had quite a number of them lately, especially since I've been on Coast to Coast a couple of times. And then I just did a Beyond Belief show on the Gaia Network. And so I've had a lot of requests for those. They're good because I get people around the world. And so it's nice to, just to not have the time zone hassles and be able to email. I do a lot of the international ones on WhatsApp. That WhatsApp seems to work best internationally.
Okay, thank you again.
This is great. Thank you, and sorry about the mix-up at the beginning.
in the time frame too.
Good
time frame. That time.
Right.
Great to see you both again.
Great to see you.
Bye
Thanks
now.
again, Julia.
Bye-bye.